You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 11th of November, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
How does Europe defend itself and Ukraine with an American leader skeptical of both? How does a war in the Middle East end when even the chief mediator decides it's hopeless? And how much would you pay for a cruise that gets you away from it all for the next 4 years? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests Daniella Peled and Simon Brooke will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear about the intangible cultural heritage that is dry stone walling in Spain. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm Chris Chermak. I'm joined today by Simon Brooke, journalist and communications consultant, and Daniella Peled, managing editor of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Hello.
I wanted to start by going back to last week. I am just returning from Washington, D.C., where many listeners will know that we were doing a series of live shows ahead of the elections. But we were just talking before. Where were you both at the moment of the elections? Did you stay up? Did you check your phone first thing in the morning? How did that look for you, Daniela?
I certainly didn't stay up. I fortified myself by going to the pub with another journalist friend, drinking enormous quantities of red wine. So I could.
Was this foreshadowing what you thought was going to happen?
This is just a usual afternoon.
Nothing special.
But nothing special. Nothing special. But I felt this sort of softened the blow. This sort of softened the blow, I feel, when I woke up the next morning and I could see like lots of message alerts on my phone. I kind of knew what was going to happen, so I just put my head back under the duvet for a while.
And Simon, you were saying this felt very 2016-ish for you.
Yeah, it became there's a touch of déjà vu, really. Exactly. I had an early night, but like you, Daniela, did the same thing. As I looked at my phone in the morning, and I thought, yeah, I've done this before. That, please let it not be true. Oh, God, yes, it is true. So 2016, the last time he was elected, Brexit as well, and then various other elections since. So, it's going to be quite a regular occurrence,
Is that a sort of silver lining here? We've only had the one really big one, like 2016 was Brexit and Trump. Now, well, we're kind of just, I don't know if we're immune to all the other things happening, but, it's just Trump again.
Trump again and again and again. I don't know, because I had a work trip the following day to go to Paris. So I went to Heathrow, very, very busy. And I looked around and, I was trying to tell myself a story saying, look, everyone looks really worried and upset. And this is something big that's happening. But actually, I'm not sure that it had registered as much to, the multitudes of people just focusing on getting on with their lives, and I don't think that's really going to change very much.
That is a fair point. Simon, you too? Do you feel like, people do, it was even in Washington, D.C., it was kind of that way. People just the next day and like the couple of days after, it's just sort of, you get on with your life.
I think it's sort of priced in for a lot of people, isn't it? I suppose the concern for a lot of people was this time he has a plan. Last time it was a bit of a surprise, so he was really scrambling to get together an administration, whereas this time he obviously has a strategy in place. He has people that he wants to appoint, so it does look like that he is going to hit the ground running. But then there was part of me that just thinks, well, we're all in the same boat together, really. It's not each of us has been individually badly affected by this. We're all going to have to deal with it. And as you say, Daniela, people getting on with their everyday lives. My interest will be in whether the sort of inherent contradictions of his promises and the administration's platform, whether they just collapse. I mean, he wants to reduce prices, but he's going to introduce tariffs, just to give one example. So it'll be an interesting 4 years, I think.
It will be an interesting 4 years. And speaking of Paris, Daniela, we're going to start there because today is Armistice Day and marking the end of World War I. And joining French Prime Minister Emmanuel Macron in Paris this year was British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. It marks the first time since 1944 that the British and French leaders have come together to mark the occasion. And with the victory of Donald Trump last week in the United States, they will have plenty to talk about on the sidelines, including the armistice of sorts that Trump is widely expected to foist upon Ukraine once he gets into office. as well as how to better defend Europe should the Trump administration consider pulling back on some of its commitments to the transatlantic alliance. Daniella, is there a new reality setting in for Ukraine at this point, given the result from last week that a sort of land for peace deal is inevitable?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Trump very famously said that he was going to solve the situation in Ukraine in 24 hours, which makes it kind of clear, I think, what the parameters of that would be. The war is not going well. It hasn't been going well for a while. And Biden, during his lame duck presidency, might conceivably pour as much resources as he can in. But at the same time, we're fighting over battle lines. I might be being unnecessarily pessimistic, but the indication so far is that the Trump administration will say, well, Crimea was lost immediately. And the most likely thing to me is that the four parts of Ukraine, which Putin has now said it is Russia, that will be sliced off, and Ukraine will be forced to accept a land for peace deal, which will not really be peace, and will be, I think, in the long term, destructive, not just for Ukraine, but for in a wider sense for Europe.
To Europe, Simon, I mean, do you get the feeling that there's this new reality setting in for Europe as well when we talk about meetings with Starmer and Macron, also Macron and Scholz? Scholz of Germany talked about a return to peace in Europe in his own call with Donald Trump. I mean, does that give you the sense that, I suppose, yes, that even Europe is forced to accept this now, or are they going to try and fight back to some of what Daniella was suggesting?
I think what's interesting is that you can tell that obviously since Trump, even before he got the nomination, there's been a feeling in Europe that we have to be prepared for Trump. We have to get a strategy in place that will deal with the Trump administration. At least that's been the theory. But I think what has not happened is there's no evidence yet of it being put into practice. I think a lot of the problem is there just isn't a strong European leadership, is there? I mean, traditionally, Europe has been managed by that Franco-German axis. And of course, we've got Macron, who is severely weakened. We've got Scholz, who is, the leader of a very unpopular administration, which
is about to collapse.
Which is about to collapse anyway, and just put it out of its misery. Please, will you do that sort of thing? So, is Giorgia Meloni, is she going to be the person on the other end of the phone when Trump calls Europe? I don't know. I do think, and the Ukraine thing I think is interesting, because obviously this is an opportunity for Europe to really take the agenda with Ukraine, to get on the front foot. But you can see how Zelensky, with his enthusiastic welcoming of Trump and his, congratulations and stuff. And I get the feeling perhaps that Zelensky is thinking that he's just fed up with this drip of support from Biden, that he's getting something, but just not enough. Whether a Trump administration represents a complete change. And interesting that J.D. Vance, the Vice President-elect, has suggested, as you say, Daniela, this sort of just basically freeze things on the current lines or whatever, which would not be good for Ukraine. But then it was interesting, Mike Pompeo, a former Secretary of State, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal sort of urging greater financial and military support for Ukraine and even a possibility of NATO membership. So I get the feeling from what I'm reading that Ukraine sees there are possibilities here.
The question is, though, just one thing about that. What is the value of NATO membership going to be in a few months, given Donald Trump's forthright views on the whole alliance?
What is it worth?
Well, that was exactly what I wanted to ask you about, Daniela, because in theory, at least if one wanted to play some sort of devil's advocate, could a land for peace deal be not all bad if it came with some form of very aggressive security guarantees for Ukraine, whether that is NATO membership specifically or something else, something to guarantee that Putin could never do this again? Is that kind of maybe what Ukraine should focus on getting out of Trump? Although, as you say, he hasn't always been good on security guarantees.
I don't see how that's possible, though, because the land for peace deal will basically be emboldening Russia to continue its policies. I mean, there's a very strong argument to make that after after Crimea was invaded, that was it. Well, Russia acted with more or less impunity in Syria. That turned the tide of the war there, and was just allowed to sort of feel its way forward. Europe has been supportive of Ukraine. In fact, surprisingly so, I would say. I think that perhaps the Russian calculation was it would hurt Europe, especially given fuel prices. 1 or 2 cold winters would do it, and they would say, right, let's give up Ukraine. So there has been support, but it hasn't been overwhelming enough to swing the tide one way or another. I mean, we see this across Europe. I mean, if Giorgia Meloni is Trump's correspondent in Europe, at least she is quite pro-Ukraine. I mean, there is something to be said for that. But the right-wing tide is continuing, and something about this right-wing tide is also isolationist. And I don't think that this idea that we're all defending this sort of Western liberal democracy and that is the way to go, I'm not sure it has as much traction. We look at the elections in Moldova, for instance, where the pro-European candidate was elected, but by a small margin and mostly by the diaspora. And also the referendum on accession to the EU was won by the tiniest of margins. So the idea that actually we're safer off with Russia and Russia can offer an alternative is not really that much of a fringe view, even in countries like Moldova, which are part of Europe, and makes a lot of sense for it to be even more part of Europe.
Simon, I did want to ask you about the UK specifically, because there's famously this historic special relationship with the United States. Maybe under some previous prime ministers, Boris Johnson comes to mind, maybe had a certain relationship with Donald Trump. But where do you expect Keir Starmer to go with this? Is the fact that perhaps he's in France this week a sign that this is kind of the direction he's going, closer to Europe, that's really his only option?
I think the thing about the special relationship is it's always something that means more to the British than it does to the Americans. If you look at the sort of clout, if you like, on the global stage, and also, economic factors. The particular problem, and then of course the ideal has always been that Britain geographically, economically, socially, politically, whatever, would be a linchpin between the US and Europe. And this is something that Tony Blair and other leaders have very much hoped for, but it's never sort of materialised. So obviously Starmer will be trying to do a bit of both. He's, as you say, he's in Paris at the moment. It looks like he's being warmly welcomed by Macron, the French. The slight problem he has, of course, with Trump is that a lot of his supporters, his MPs, party members, were absolutely revolted by the idea of him having to go cap in hand and be nice to Mr. Trump. It's interesting to see that the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, obviously was very rude about Mr. Trump and has now said, I had dinner with him, we got on very well. And so it looks like he might have got away with it. But I always think the fact that we never thought Trump would come back means that a lot of politicians are doing that thing where if you've ever had a friend who's had a girlfriend, boyfriend or whatever, who you've absolutely loathed, they split up. You said, you're so much better off without him or her or whatever. Absolutely horrible person, have nothing more to do with them. Then next thing, you're being invited to the wedding and oh, sorry, did I really say that? So it'll be interesting to see whether under a Starmer government they can sort of maintain that balance between Europe and the US.
So many world leaders doing their best to ingratiate themselves with Donald Trump. But let's turn now to the Middle East, where the already thankless task of mediating an end to the war in Gaza has become just that bit harder. Qatar says it has suspended mediation efforts between Israel and Hamas and forced Hamas to close its political office in Doha. Neither side has been willing to engage constructively, according to the Qataris. Daniella, were you surprised by this move from Qatar?
Well, we'd reached a deadlock in the ceasefire deals. I mean, it was from more or less even October the 8th, it was clear how this would end. There would be a hostage release, and that would mean a prisoner release as well from the Israeli side. Soon after, it was clear that what Israel's demands would be that Hamas would not return to rule the territory of Gaza, and there would need to be another sort of separate civilian functioning authority. So that the parameters were there, but we've been very, very far from reaching them. I mean, both sides really have been
for the entire time
super intransigent. Yeah, exactly. And the Israelis, clearly, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu, I'm sure, delighted by Trump's victory, always enjoyed a very warm relationship with him. And I think his vision of the Middle East it coincides more with Trump's vision. He can't really make any concessions because that would destroy his own coalition, which is supported by the far right. And if his coalition fell, then he would likely have to, his trials for corruption would continue and so on and so forth. If he manages to keep this coalition going, he can stay in power till 2026. So Netanyahu has got interests in not negotiating. His recently fired Defense Secretary Yoav Gallant made clear, I mean, he might be feeling quite bitter, but made clear that the army had achieved everything that could be achieved militarily in Gaza. So what is happening now, it seems to be, is that, again, as we were talking about in Ukraine, that people, all sides are now sort of trying to see what territory they can get. Literally, in Israel's case, it seems to be solidifying its control over parts of Gaza. The idea that Israel would move back in, there might even be settlements, which seemed so ludicrous, frankly, a year ago, is becoming much, much more plausible.
Simon, if the Qataris have left, and with everything that Daniella is saying there about trying to consolidate, does this once again go back to Donald Trump and him coming in? And I wonder if, to this point, like, are both sides kind of, they have a few months now, but might there be some expectation that at the point that Donald Trump enters office, he is kind of tired of this whole conflict and just wants it to end?
I'm sure he does. After all, one of the reasons why Donald Trump was elected was because he connected with the fact that tens of millions of Americans are fed up with the US playing world policeman and getting drawn into these these battles and conflicts. And, you know, one of the things we saw with the beginning of the Biden administration was that chaotic withdrawal for Afghanistan. And, I think that'll be very much in the minds of the Trump administration. They do not want to get involved in that kind of mess. And the problem with this, of course, is that it's so... there's so many complications. It's so unlikely you will ever get, an outcome which is acceptable to most people. Especially now, it looks like the two-state solution seems to be sort of moving off the table. Obviously, Netanyahu's not a fan, is he? So, we'll have to see about what happens with that. But it's, I think what he'll do is, his main objective will not to get too involved and to make sure that whatever happens, he doesn't spend most of the time in his administration sort of dealing with this very difficult issue.
I disagree with that, which is always useful for an interesting conversation.
This is what sparks debate. That's what we're here for. Go for it.
Because actually, Donald Trump is unencumbered by ideology, and it's super capricious. We know that, but as far having that background can be quite useful for him in this instance. I mean, he famously said he was going to broker the deal of the century in Israel-Palestine. He, after long sort of inaction and frustration from the American side, he actually made, I'm not sure progress is the right word, but he acted decisively. He moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, which absolutely delighted Israelis across the political spectrum, recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel, and also he brokered the Abraham Accord. So this is, Israel made peace or was recognized by a handful of other autocratic regimes in the Gulf and so on. But that has absolutely stayed rock solid despite the last year of war. He is a rare American president who's actually taken action, and the action has happened and the action has been recognized.
Well, and also to follow that up, could he be the one who might actually say withdraw Israeli aid if he's not getting his way? Is that something one might imagine him doing?
I think he has a lot more. He has a lot more power. I mean, Biden has been ritually humiliated by Netanyahu. Like right now, the Biden administration said, unless you let more aid into the Gaza Strip within a month, we're going to levy sanctions. Israel has not paid any attention. I mean, really, it's been, the contempt has been, kind of amazing. And it's true that America has many strategic reasons to support Israel. It's just about personal relationship. But I think that certainly Trump will have his ideas about this is what will happen. And on the table is the Israel-Saudi Arabia peace deal or normalization of relations. And that's never really been taken off the table. I mean, that was much vaunted just before all of the latest round of war. But Trump has also made clear that he's not too bothered by international law. He's not too bothered by supranational bodies. He's not too bothered by any of these things. And so what he will see as a solution, not the solution and not a peaceful solution to Israel-Palestine, I think it will certainly not involve... It might involve annexation of parts of the West Bank, because certainly the people in his administration seem quite keen on that. I think this two-state solution is still on the table. If anything, it's been revived by this war. But that involves negotiations and that involves bilateralism. So that's not what's going to happen. But I think that he will be quite decisive when it comes to Israel-Palestine.
Well, let's move a little further down the road from Qatar to Baku, Azerbaijan, where that old philosophical adage, if a tree falls and nobody's listening, does it make a sound, comes to mind amid a new UN Climate Change Summit, that is decidedly lacking in key decision makers. The US, China, Germany, France, and the European Commission have all backed away from sending their leaders to the COP29 summit. It is true that about 100 world leaders are attending the first few days, but without those key leaders, not to mention the expectations that Donald Trump will pull back from America's key climate commitments, it does leave you wondering about the state of climate diplomacy and multilateralism more generally. Simon, these COP29 summits, or these COP summits, always seem to, I suppose, overpromise and underdeliver, but this one does feel like a particularly bleak one, it has to be said.
It does, and I think what's interesting about the Trump administration, what we'll see probably that we saw last time, is he really doesn't like these talking shops. For Trump, I think it's much more about bilaterals, isn't it? We were talking about Europe a moment ago, and I think a threat for Europe is that Trump will seek to do individual deals with European states rather than going across the, pan-EU structures and things. And I think there's a real risk here, if you are a fan of multilaterals, that Trump will look to do deals in a very much a sort of crude in sense of terms of payment and things. What can I get? Your gain is my loss, sort of thing, or vice versa. What can I do here? So I think the challenge for countries around the world is to adapt to that new reality and say, well, listen, if we have to do deals with Trump in a kind of bilateral, it's like his relationship with Putin and Netanyahu and others, isn't it? It's very much a personal two guys getting together sort of thing. So if that's the way the world's biggest, most powerful nation in terms of, political and economic clout, if that's the way it behaves, then I think countries are going to have to do this. I was looking, there's quite a bit of history here with the US. Jimmy Carter, left-wing Democrat leader, president, left the membership of the International Labour Organization. Reagan left UNESCO. Bill Clinton left the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. So it does happen, very excitingly. It does happen,
It's kind of whenever the US doesn't get what it wants.
Well, I was just going to say that's the point.
A bit of a tendency.
How much clout, how much influence do they have with these organizations, and how much direct benefit does it bring? So that is the question. But I think it's going to have to be a change of tactics.
Well, to those change of tactics, Danielle, I think that's perhaps the interesting question here, isn't it? Because we do know the Trump administration's approach to multilateralism. It's not necessarily something we're going to expect to change this time around compared to last time, but maybe the approach of countries to him and how they negotiate with him and the ways that they find to get him to agree to either international or bilateral deals. That's the part that changes. We know how to try and get to him now.
I'm not, considering that we're led by a former human rights lawyer, I'm not sure that kind of bromance is really going to go anywhere between the UK and the United States. I think part of the issue with multilateralism is, which I'm a big fan of, by the way, is that it's not definitive. It doesn't work fast. It's always imperfect and it's always frustrating. And I think this was also something that was sold to people. If we talk about Brexit, all kinds of problems with the European Union, quite legitimate complaints, was the right answer to completely divorce from it. Well, I don't think so. The same with the UN. The UN has proved itself super toothless. Over Gaza, for instance. Overall conflicts. Everyone ignores UN resolutions. It's pretty good on culture and aid programs. It does well, but the problem is, what is the alternative? Like democracy itself, it isn't perfect, but as we're about to see, the alternative is inevitably worse. But the thing is, part of populism and part of Trump's populism is selling that idea that multilateralism is a failure and fails, and that we all lose. What happens though if you're powerful? You don't lose so much. It's the rest of us that don't have that huge economic clout and huge military clout that are going to have problems. I have nothing positive to say about how these individual things will be negotiated, because I really don't think there is. And I think we have to brace ourselves that we're going to see the very important issues that affect all our daily lives, and quite sort of mundane parts of our lives are going to be down to negotiations with strongmen leaders.
Well, Simon, just to try and give us something a little positive on this, I mean, is there something that you imagine the UN should be doing right now, something that it can do in this kind of age of nationalist leaders? Is there a space where you imagine they might have some kind of clout?
Well, I'm slightly more optimistic, I have to say, possibly, unless I've been drinking the Kool-Aid, as they say. But, it's interesting how people talk about, for instance, NATO, that if we see this withdrawal of American support from NATO and, from European defence, does that mean that NATO members of the European Union are going to have to sort of up their game a bit and almost grow up, if you like, without being able to rely on the US. So perhaps for the next 4 years, that's an opportunity for these
regional multilateralism.
Well, exactly, yeah, but something like that, an evolution where some of these multilateral organisations can actually say, well, here's an opportunity. Let's turn a threat, if you like, into an opportunity, and let's see if we can do something about it, just to sort of up our game to be a little bit more energetic, a little bit more creative, and just accept the fact that we're dealing with a US administration that really is not interested in traditionally how we've always worked. So let's try something new.
Well, just in case we have completely exhausted our listeners with bleakness on today's show and you just want to get away from it all, there is a cruise for you. The residential cruise ship Odyssey by Villa V last week began offering its quote, skip forward package. It's a 4-year cruise visiting 140 countries for the low price of just £255,999. There is also a 2-year midterm selection package you can pick if you are more inclined to do that. Daniella, does this sound like an option for you, better than simply hibernating, hiding under the duvet as you described last week?
Well, I have to say this does actually give me hope for humanity, because what a great example of human ingenuity, using this as a marketing, this potential disaster as a marketing opportunity.
There's always a marketing opportunity.
I like that. This is the humans have managed to get cats skateboarding, and they've managed to come up with this as well. So there is hope. But I've never been on a cruise. It sounds.
Is this the moment? Would this be the moment to just up and get away?
Well,
this is the time for a cruise.
You'd be stuck on a boat with a lot of other people. There'd be nowhere to go. It travels the world, but what countries are we going to go to? Unless we stick to sort of Scandinavia and Western Europe, there's going to be some
a war zone cruise.
That might be
from
more,
a distance.
That might appeal more. Yeah. So if you don't set foot on land for the 2 or for the 4 years, that might make sense. But otherwise, reality will intrude.
Simon, would you be tempted? How quickly would we get bored of all the people on a 4-year cruise?
Well, I'm going to be really pessimistic now, because I can't think of anything worse than a cruise. I have to say my nearest experience was back in the summer when I, like many journalists, went to a PR event on a boat. And of course, like many journalists, I hoovered up as many canapes as I could, necked as many bottles of champagne as I could, and then said to my fellow guests, well, it's been lovely. Thank you. I'm off now. Thank you very much. And I remember they gave me a bit of a funny look, and I realised why when I climbed back up unsteadily onto deck and realised we'd slipped anchor or whatever. We were off down the Thames. So short of jumping over and swimming to shore, which was really tempting, actually, I have to say, I then had to get back on the boat. Hello, me again, sort of thing. So isn't the whole point about a cruise that you can't avoid the conversation? You're stuck with your fellow cruise members or whatever, night after night, discussing the same thing.
That's a fair point. I'd have to look at also the press release. There would have to be a no politics rule or something like this for this to really take off.
So what are they going to arrest you, drag you away from the table by your hair because you mentioned the Trump word, or I don't know.
Well, I did, just before you both go, want to ask, aside from a cruise, I was curious though, if either of you had sort of your best options for taking a break from the news and the bleakness. What do you do to just kind of get away from it all yourselves, Daniella?
I think I've already made it clear. It involves the duvet. It's cheap, if not free. It's transportable. Add an electric blanket to the mix and you're laughing.
Simon?
Go to the movies. I saw an amazing film on Saturday afternoon when I was so depressed about various things in the news. Small things like these with Cillian Murphy. Absolutely enthralling. I'm thinking boats again. Absolutely enthralling is what I'm trying to say. And I really was, I managed to avoid the news, avoid all the depressing things that are happening, and was completely drawn into this amazing film.
Daniella Peled and Simon Brooke, thank you very much for joining us on our Bleak Show today. For our last item, we will head to Spain, where a centuries-old technique is now at risk of disappearing. Recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage, dry stone walling holds ecological and cultural significance. Isabella Orlando explores their past, present, and the growing movement to restore this ancient practice.
The Spanish countryside is a patchwork of hugely varied landscapes, ranging from lush green hills to flat arid plains to craggy mountains. If there's one thing that's consistent about Spain's rural areas, apart from the almond, olive, and carob trees that grow across the country, it's the striped terraces that mark the landscape, made up of rows upon rows of low stone walls. These walls represent a specialist building technique known as dry stone walling, identified by UNESCO as a form of intangible cultural heritage. Their construction, abandonment, and need for revitalization speak to larger cultural and ecological issues in the region. So I went out in search of people who could tell me more about this now rare building tradition and met Daniel Eden DeWitt, who runs Cultural Center Miraposa in the south of Spain.
I live in Andalusia, in fact the only real desert that we have in Europe, with high evaporation, lots of sun, 330 days of sun a year, and rainfall that is below 200 millimeters per square meter. People have been living under these harsh conditions for generations and generations, and part of why they have been able to survive here are the dry stone walls, are the terraces that are like water towers in the mountains. Where we are here, the rainfalls are very rare, and if they come, they can be torrential. And if a torrential rainfall ravages the land, they cause erosion, and all the fertile soil that could build up for maybe a year or 2 years is being washed away.
So the walls do much more than divide up land. They're a traditional method of supporting the fertility and habitability of these dry regions.
So these terraces, they have flat surfaces, and they prevent the fertile soil from just washing into the ocean, basically. And also, they store water by slowing down the water and infiltrating it into the mountains, and then slowly, over the course of years, by gravitation, releasing it into the landscape, into the valley again.
Every element of this landscape is interdependent, so if the stone walls fall into disrepair, the effects are widespread.
If these terraces are not intact, much less water can infiltrate into the ground, and this diminishes the resilience of the whole area. We are expecting longer and heavier droughts. There is less water in the landscape, which in turn means there is less plant growth, and then the food chain thins out.
Dry stone walling has been vital to the ecology of dry Mediterranean landscapes for thousands of years. So why is it in danger now? The introduction of modern farming practices, along with the cultural and economic shifts experienced by younger generations, both play a role in the abandonment of the walls and the craft of building them.
In some regions, especially also in this particular area where I am living, the super intensive olive plantations have led to a almost depletion of the aquifers. And at the same time, the dry stone walls, the terraces have not been maintained because it's just so much manual labor. As it is much easier to just drill holes and pump the water up, it's way more cost efficient for these large scale endeavors, some of them having millions of olive trees. So this old knowledge or these old techniques have been abandoned basically, and so have the dry stone walls, which are now falling apart everywhere. In the countryside, few farmers still do it, and for the younger population it's not so much of importance. What I'm trying to do here actually is to incentivize people to come with me and go out into the countryside and rebuild the dry stone walls and be part of it. It's just so much fun.
Although many people have discontinued the practice of dry stone walling, others have picked it up, and it does sound quite fun. What's special about these walls is that there's no concrete or mortar holding the stones together. So amazingly, the technique is all about balance.
So I always describe it as a jigsaw puzzle combined with Lego, but a little bit more complicated and with a little bit heavier pieces. If I see a gap in a wall, usually it's a U-shaped or a V-shaped hole. First thing I do is I collect the stones and I sort the stones. So I can already see which stones are flat and well-shaped for the face, the front side of the wall, which stones are better for the backfilling. These are usually round-shaped stones. And then I start picking the appropriate stone for the appropriate place. In every case, it's different to balance them and to make them as tight as possible, to use the friction of the surfaces of the stones so that they stay in place.
What's exciting about dry stone wall building in Spain today is what seems to be a real trend among expats like Daniel, who are adopting and revitalizing the craft by learning it, sharing it, practicing it, and enjoying the process.
Even though it's very slow, and it's still very satisfying. It's always an event when the people come together and do a work that they can actually see. So I hope to be a part of the ongoing transmission of this knowledge and of the importance of these terraces.
In a similar spirit, slow travel and agritourism are growing across Spain and beyond, allowing guests to experience rural life and to learn about and support heritage in the places they visit. Cotswolds-raised Ed Dean grew up around the stone walls of Britain and has now relocated to Spain's Castellón province, where he's rebuilding the walls on his property, Casa de Olivos, hosting guests and sharing local heritage with them.
We're offering a beautiful little Casa Rural, and we understood that people wanted somewhere to come and detach. But we've realised we can deliver a lot more than that. We can engage people with the locality. So whether it's the natural heritage and they go out walking and discover it, whether it's the sort of cultural and food heritage, we see ourselves as guardians of this 6 acres. If we can hand it on to another generation in a slightly better state than we found it, we feel that's kind of our mission, and the walls are one part of that.
For Monocle Radio, this is Isabella Orlando.
Isabella Orlando, thank you very much. And that's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panelists, Daniella Peled and Simon Brooke. Today's show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Sana Jumani and Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Chris Chermak here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.